Without further ado, ladies and gents, let's build a motorcycle engine. So, we just had some really exciting news here in the UK, especially where I am located, which is the southwest of the UK. They've officially confirmed that as of Wednesday of this week, bikers are officially allowed to be on the road. It's just so exciting to know that as of Wednesday and when the bike is finished, I will be allowed to go out on the road on my bike for the first time this summer. I can't wait. So, without further ado, we're going to finish this bike and we're going to finish it as quickly as possible. I had a delivery today. There's the new lower bearing. Oh. They've sent me HEL style. These are not stock, obviously. But check these out. These little beauties. Nice and thin. They'll go well with the frame. They'll be hidden nicely. That looks awesome. We're putting the cylinders back on the engine tonight and we're going to start timing the engine. The engine is not completely painted. I've got more paint coming this week, but I want to get the heads back on. I'll then mask those heads and then I'll spray the base of the engine. The reason I'm doing that is to stop any paint or lacquer having any chance whatsoever of getting on the inside of the engine. Okay, ladies and gents, the first thing I want to do today is touch on the crosshatch honing method for the cylinders. If you are honing the cylinders yourselves, it is a very good idea to use the crosshatched method, and the reason being, a crosshatch pattern allows the oil to retain itself on the walls of the cylinder for longer, preventing premature damage and scrapes, scratches, etc. to the cylinder walls. Before we do this, I want to put a little bit of engine oil on the inside of the cylinder and on the honing tool itself. You saw me do this in a previous video. And the approach that I want to take when I'm honing this cylinder is I want fast vertical movements with a steady to medium rotation of the honing device itself, the honing tool. So you see how we're moving up and down quite quickly, but you can see each individual honing block, and that will give us a nice cross-hatched finish. Wipe away any excess oil, and we can give this a proper clean in just a moment when we split the head apart. Just reposition everything here for a better angle for you guys. So this was shortly after the engine blocks were painted, so we need to split them apart. We have a bolt on the front and the rear of each head and cylinder. Now we can get a good thorough cleaning going on here. And now we can reinstall the cam chain tensioner. Sits back on there. Now, before I clearly states to install the front and rear chain tensioners by tightening the mounting bolts, tightening torque 8 to 12 Newton meters, 0.8 to 1.2 kilogram meters, or 6 to 8.5 foot-pounds. So I'm just going to tighten these down by hand for a moment. It doesn't mention anything about lock thread locker. Okay, so now that the cam chain tensioner is back in place, we need to set it, remember? So we need to compress it and lock the ratchet in place so that we can get it back onto the cylinder, back onto the head. But we need a device that we can leave in there and keep it locked in place until we've pulled that cam chain from the engine up and through, until we are ready to set the timing of the engine. So we need something that can stay in there, that's rigid and strong enough, but still gives us enough maneuverability that we can reach it from the top of the head casing, of the top of the head. So we need to put a bit of pressure on the ratchet here, pull the ratchet in. Should have put this in my other hand first. And then we need to put a stopper inside the ratchet. Pop that Allen key in there. And there we go. Now we need to obviously take care of this while we're putting it back together. But that should give us enough wiggle room. Okay, so now we can double check that the surface area for the cylinder on the bottom of the engine is nice and clean. And we can move on to removing the circlip from the piston and removing the slider from the piston. Just going to use a set of long nose needle pliers here to remove the circlip. Take your time with this, and it's always a good idea to cover up any voids that the engine might have in it, so that if that circlip decides to do one on you, it's not going to end up in the bottom of the engine. I'll go ahead and pop that out. Work your way around, providing even pressure along the circlip so you don't snap it. And make sure you keep that safe, because we'll need it when we reinstall. Then put a bit of pressure on the opposing side for the slider in the hole there, work it free, and the piston itself will start to come off of the engine. There we are. It's a good idea to start taking note of where everything goes. Make sure that you put everything back in the same orientation. There's no markings on this side of the piston, whereas if we were to turn it around, you can see that there is a 38B. So we know that that 38B must go to the left-hand side of the rear cylinder. This is just a very soft wire brush. I don't want to scratch the piston, I don't want to score the piston. I just want to get rid of any of that loose carbon that's on top of the piston before we go reinstalling it into the engine. I've used the piston ring clamp as a protective guide there to try and prevent any carbon getting down into the piston rings themselves, but we'll give that a check in a moment and make sure that no carbon made its way down into the rings. Pop off the ring clamp like so, and we can double check everything. There's a little bit on the rim that we need to clean down, but there was no carbon inside the piston rings themselves, which is always good. Some old gasket material in here, and some of the old paint is flaking away. We want to try and get rid of that as best we can. And any cleaning agent that we might have used to clean the inside of the cylinder, that might have leaked through, so we need to. Okay, I've got a stopper in there that I'll be able to remove that little stopper once it's on the engine. Okay, so effectively the cylinder is going to go onto the engine from this direction where I am. It's going to go on in this orientation, cylinder here, cam chain here. Now, with that in mind, we know that the exhaust side is over here. This is the exhaust side. So that little arrow on the piston needs to face forward. Now, the next step is not to go ahead and install this, but to make sure and double check that these rings are in their correct location. Because we've been messing with the pistons, these rings have had the chance to move. So we're going to refer back to the manual, or if you don't have a manual, you can click the link up here and go and watch the piston ring video, which will explain everything in more detail. But we need to make sure that these rings are in the right location before we put the ring clamp on there and pre-install it into the cylinder. Okay, so the piston rings are now in their correct location, and we know that this little arrow on top has to face that way into this cylinder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this cylinder upside down, and I'm going to turn the piston upside down. Now the front is on this side, so we've got the front of the piston here and the front of the cylinder here. So when we install said piston into the cylinder, everything will be in the correct orientation. So I'm going to take my ring clamp, I'm going to place it over the top of the piston, try my hardest not to touch the rings until the clamp starts gripping. Otherwise we run the risk of moving those rings out of position. I want to make sure it's nice and tight. There we are. So once the clamp is on as tight as we can, I want to push the piston down about ½ a centimetre until the first ring is just inside the clamp, but the top of the piston is just poking out. So we're going to give it a little encouragement, and you can see the piston will move, but you want to take your time. Try and make it even all the way around, but don't go too far, otherwise we'll have to start all over again because the rings will not be clamped. We got our arrow mark on the top, which we know has to go in upside down this way. So the front is now this side, same as the cylinder, now being this side. And now we can install the piston into the cylinder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place this ridge, this edge here that we've just created, taking note of the arrow on the front. I'm going to place it into the cylinder, like so. Now you'll be able to tell whether or not it's straight because the holes on the inside here, they need to be completely parallel to the cylinder. So we can pop that in there like so. Don't force anything. And now we can apply pressure downwards very carefully and evenly, and the and the pistons and the rings will start to make their way down into the cylinder. Okay, so we had a bit of pressure there, and you see how the rings popped out of the clamp? Hope you guys can see this. The ring has popped out of the clamp, so we need to restart this process. I need to get this ring inside the clamp. And let's try again, a bit of pressure. Okay, I think that we are in. Let's take off the clamp, and there we are. Your piston's pre-installed. We've actually gone a little bit too far because right now you can see how we've come down, and there's no way we'll be able to get that slider back in its current state. Okay, so we need to lift this back up ever so slightly. Don't want to pull it out all the way, just want to get it so that the slider can fit through, making sure that the rings don't all spring out of position. There we are. And you can see now that that slider goes in and out. There we are. So now that that is effectively on, we can go ahead and grab our cam chain here, pull that up through the top. In order for me to continue to push down on this piston and get it to come up through the cylinder, I need to stop the engine from turning over. So, and don't do what I've just done. How many of you have been screaming gasket for the last 5-10 minutes? Because I've just realised I forgot to put the gasket on. So this is all going to come off, and we need to start again. Live and learn, people, live and learn. Gasket. Chain can go back inside for a moment. The piston. got to take note of a few things here. So we've got the chain tensioner. We've also got it's good if you're able to position the head like this so you can get both hands on this. Make sure you've covered up the voids in the engine so that if the circlip decides to spring away from its position, that it doesn't end up in the bottom of the engine. Now, if we just go around and click it into place. Okay, now I'm going to put a rag under the piston here because I really don't want to chew up this new gasket if I can help it. So what can often happen when you've been putting that cam chain down into the bottom end is that it can get snagged together. So all I'm doing here is rolling the crank back and forwards just ever so slightly to loosen that chain up to unsnag it. And then I'm just giving some very, very soft taps to the top of the cylinder just to encourage it down onto the piston. As you can see, the good woman of my life is over there, and she's holding the crank in position to stop the engine from rolling over. And there we are. It's important that chain guide goes back into its correct location, which is in front of the arm of the cam chain tensioner. It's a 17mm spanner that you're going to need for the crank itself. And what we can do now is we can get that chain out of the bottom end of the engine. We're going to use a telescopic magnet here because then we need to install the second cam chain guide on the opposing side. Put something weighted in there to keep it from falling back in. Okay, so now we need to install the second cam chain guide. This knobbly bit, that needs to sit inside the cylinder. These can be a bit tricky to fit because the chain at the bottom can often get in the way, but take your time, don't lose your temper, and just it will fit. It is supposed to go in there. Now I'm just rolling the engine back and forwards ever so slightly, and I'm doing this just to make sure that the cam chain itself is not snagged at the bottom and that it is rotating with the engine. Now that the cam chain guide is installed, we can go ahead and put on a new gasket. If you've got this far and you haven't ordered new gaskets, you really need to go ahead and buy a set. I'll put a link in the description. There is absolutely no point in rebuilding your engine to this extent and not changing the gaskets. Pop the chain back into the bottom end. You can take the head and place that back on the top of the engine. Give it a little push down, make sure it's firmly seated. Should then be able to grab our magnet and fish that down into the bottom end and pull that chain up for the final time. There we are. And we can put something weighted on the end of that to make sure it doesn't fall back in. And the last thing to do at this point is to put in the cylinder bolts in the correct orientation. It's important you take note of this next step because there is a little caveat that you need to be aware of. So the last thing I want to do today for you guys is put the head bolts back in the correct orientation. It can be a bit daunting when you're taking them out for the first time because they are all different lengths. This is how they look. If you don't remember what they look like from the previous video, they are all different lengths, but fortunately, as per everything and every question that I've ever needed an answer to, we can look in the manual and it's got everything written down for us. But we've got bolt length across here, and each of those has been assigned a number, and we've got the front cylinder, the rear cylinder, and corresponding numbers, so we know exactly which bolt goes in which hole. We just need to measure each bolt. Okay, something to bear in mind when you're measuring these bolts. if you are tempted to do this from the head, you're going to be getting things wrong. You need to go from the underside of the head to the end of the thread. Okay, so the first bolt I need is 200mm, 20 centimeters or 7.9 inches. And by the process of elimination, by checking that bolt up against all the others, I know that that is the only bolt that has that measurement of 200mm, which is the only bolt on the schematic. This is where things start to get interesting. This bolt, that 200mm bolt that you've just seen me insert into the bottom left of the rear cylinder, is not correct, even though it states it in the schematics within the workshop manual. Keep watching and you'll see where it's supposed to go. The next one I'm going to put in is bolt number 2, which is next to bolt number 1, and that has a measurement of 190mm or 7.5 inches. And there we are, that is 190mm or 7.5 inches. So we know that this bolt goes here. Next we'll go with another number 2 bolt, which is 190mm. Let's measure that up. There we are, 190mm, and that's going in this position here, like so. Bolt number 3, which goes parallel to this one at the back, measures 180mm. So we'll check our bolt. Yep, that's at 180mm. That clean down, it's a bit dusty, and pop that in there. So the workshop manual states that we need to do an initial torque setting on each of these bolts of 25 Newton meters, and I'd recommend doing this in a star formation. Once complete, you can tighten them down to 35 Newton meters. Okay, so we just flip these down. Not actually going to put any torque on them as such. That one. 180. 2 is 190. 4, which is 215. That one. So this bolt on the front cylinder, on the bottom left of the front cylinder, measures at 215mm, and the workshop manual states that it must go in this location. This is a misprint. No matter how much torque and how much pressure I put on this bolt, it would not seat in this location, to the point where the bolt would twist and it felt like it was going to snap. I did some research online. This 215mm bolt must switch places with the 200mm bolt from the rear cylinder that I referenced earlier. And the front one is the last one.